Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Our webinar today is presented by IDSA member MorganFranklin Consulting, entitled Shifting Your IAM Program from Compliance-Driven to Security-Driven. MorganFranklin provides end-to-end client services that include program strategy, governance, risk and compliance, identity and access management, cybersecurity operations, incident response, business and technology resilience, risk intelligence, and a complete portfolio of managed security services. For more information, visit morganfranklin.com. So before we get started, I want to point out a few logistics. We are recording today's discussion, so please make sure to share the link with your colleagues. You'll be able to submit questions through the Q&A chat window if you have any as the discussion unfolds, so please make sure to submit them. There are also a few additional resources in the attachment section of the portal, including the slides from this session. So make sure to check out those links and download the slides if you're interested. Before I turn it over to our presenters today, a quick commercial for the Identity Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-defined security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members, who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. All of our resources are freely available on our website, idsalliance.org. All right, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters for today. Tom Malta is currently CEO and principal at IAM Experts, a boutique cybersecurity startup focused on helping international clients with IAM design, strategic advisory, and execution. Previously, Tom was the global head of IAM at Navy Federal Credit Union, where he was responsible for design, development, and execution of build-buy solutions supporting both internal personnel and customers. He has over 25 years in financial services technology and cybersecurity as a hands-on developer, building and supporting front office trading systems for many of the top Wall Street brokerages and investment banks. Perry Menendez is a managing director for the Global Cybersecurity Professional Services practice at MorganFranklin and leads the financial services industry sector. Prior to joining MorganFranklin Consulting, Perry was the managing director at KPMG, leading their consulting and advisory cybersecurity practice for the banking sector. With over 20 years of business experience across multiple disciplines, including IT, finance, strategy, cyber, tech, risk, and business transformation, Perry led and assisted some of the largest organizations in the world navigate significant transformations of their IT, cyber, and business operations. Zubayd Kazmi is the managing director for identity and access management at MorganFranklin Consulting. Prior to joining MorganFranklin, Zubayd held managing director and director positions at large and boutique consulting firms with a specific focus on identity and access management. Zubayd has successfully worked with Fortune 500 organizations, helping them modernize their IAM programs, implement adaptable technologies, and maintain momentum of their programs. So with that, I'm going to end the slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Zubayd for you. Have a great discussion.
Thank you, Julie. Appreciate it. And thank you for the rest of our folks that are on this panel for joining me today. Today, I just want to quickly talk about what the goal and objectives are for today's webinar. It's not really to identify which initiatives are good or bad or which technologies should be doing what. It's really about your cyber organization or a cyber organization or an IAM program and what they should be focusing on, where they should be putting their energy and efforts. We'll bring some examples of organizations we've certainly worked with or in. We'll give our thoughts on tactical steps organizations can take. And this is really going to be an organic conversation, and there'll be a deck available afterwards that can highlight some of our key talking points that we had here. I would like to certainly encourage everybody to ask questions throughout so you can be part of the conversation, and we'll try to get to them as close as real time as possible. So let's start off with really the kind of the whole premise of this all, which is shifting away from compliance-focused organizations to or a program to security-driven. I think the first thing that we need to first identify is what does that mean? What does it mean to be too compliance-driven or compliance-focused? And I think that comes down to, identifying what's the stated mission of your department or program, and how well are you aligned to that original mission or objective. It's very easy for organizations, at least in my experience, to start addressing, a gap or SD, and then start continuing to chase the next gap or the next compliance initiative. And then, before you know it, you have resources that are less focused on cyber and advancing your cyber capabilities, and more focused on supporting audit readiness or audit investigations and things like that. Your organization can become very technology driven versus purpose driven. It can also become very easy to be myopic in where organizational risks actually lie within the organization, because you're only looking at compliance at the end of the day. And I think the biggest thing, and these are some things we're certainly going to talk about, is, what's the effectiveness of compliance? At the end of the day, the compliance has a certain spirit behind it, an objective. And if you start losing that because the end users aren't committed or aren't aligned with that vision, then what's the really value of that compliance at the end of the day, or that control? What I find interesting is that organizations that are not heavily regulated or not driven by, SOX requirements and things like that, are still investing money into cybersecurity initiatives. And I think we all know why. We see it in the news. We see it in what's happening around us. There's things that are happening just yesterday and day before yesterday that bring to light why cybersecurity is critically important. And I think that's part of what we're going to talk about, is how we start transitioning the conversation, right, from compliance to something that goes broader than that. But then along the way, maybe finding true compliance through that journey. Tom, I know when we talked yesterday, kind of just prepping for this webinar, you had kind of an anecdote of an experience of where an organization was maybe too compliance focused, and some of the ramifications of that. So I thought this would be a good time for you to maybe talk about that. We can just go from there.
Yeah, no, and it's exciting to be here and talk about this, right? I think, and you highlighted a couple of great things, Abid, in the opening comments there. I think, organizations typically, particularly the larger organizations that are doing IAM, might be doing IAM for a while, right? What was that really driven by? Was it originally driven by, the technology department and the CISO saying, hey, we need a great IAM program? A lot of times it's not, right? It's because, either an internal auditor or a regulator comes in and says, hey, you're not doing access management right. And they ding you on one or more things, right? You mentioned SD, or significant deficiency, as one of them. And in my career, certainly more than once, right, I've walked into an organization where I was hired to come in, and when I sat down with the CISO, it was, hey, Tom, we need to be closing these things, right? This is what I want you to focus on. And this is the most important thing for us to do. I think, and hindsight's 2020, right? But the experience of that is that, more often than not, I've come in, worked with a system integrator, right, to get that done, whatever that thing was, right? And 2 or 3 years go by, and during that time, yeah, we're making progress on closing that gap, but we're not innovating, right? We're not moving the needle ahead anywhere in the IAM program. And what's happening is the business and, our employees and our partners and the people who are just, there to, support us from an access management perspective, meaning, hey, Tom, what is it that you need me doing, to help make this better? And if the conversation is constantly around, hey, we just need to do this one thing to close this one gap, you end up spending all that money and energy on that, and then you forget about the fact that we need to evolve, right? And we need to mature. And the other point I think you touched on, which was great as well, Zabid, is that I think at the end of the day, it's a delicate balance, right? You can't have everything focused on compliance. You can't have everything focused on innovation. You need to balance it, right? And it's important that there is a balance, because at the end of that, you want to be able to move that curve a little bit further ahead, right? And not wait until 2 or 3 years. Yeah, we closed our SD, and now we're ready to actually innovate. Well, guess what? You're now way behind where your competitors are. And if you're in an organization that is, competing with others of your peers, if you will, they to your point, might have innovated and moved ahead, right? So anyway, I hope that kind of adds a little bit more color to it, and just to ground, the audience on, compliance is important, right? All of us here are not saying it isn't. I think the main thing, as you'll hear us say throughout today's session, is that you got to have that balance, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And one of the things you said, like your competitors may have advanced beyond, is that at the end of the day, these IAM functions are business enablers, right? They are sometimes a competitive advantage, right? Because they either remove barriers from the business, right? Or even maybe they are marketable services and things like that, right? So I think that's a great point where, you have to look at it from a business competitive landscape, because now you're impacting where your organization could have been, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and as you guys know, I mean, it's workforce IAM, it's customer IAM too, right?
Right.
And if, in particular on the customer side, if we're not innovating, we're not providing a frictionless experience for our customers, we're not hopefully moving away from user ID and passwords, right? As you know, I'm very passionate about that topic. I think we're going to lose to our competition, right? And whatever your company is, right, you can put yourself in our shoes, right, and think about your competition. And so that's important. And it's just, you have to show value, right? These programs are so large, so long, complex. And if it's completely grounded on just compliance, you're going to make the auditors happy. You're going to make your regulators happy. You're not going to make the business happy, and you're not going to advance the bar, right? So.
Yeah. Perry, did you have thoughts on that too?
Oh, absolutely. Everything, Tom, what you just said, spot on over there. I'll just add one more layer to that one, Zubayd. Compliance, actually, if you look at the whole historical nature of it, often at times you'll see blips in compliance activities taking hold if there is a larger geopolitical or administrative changes that are happening. So 2001, the whole bubble burst out there, the Y2K kind of blipped a little bit over there. Financial crisis, more regulations came on, there was a blip over there. The previous administration looking at regulations from a different perspective, it goes down. The new administration comes in, it goes up. Whenever these blips start happening, right, that starts putting a pressure on the internal audit, on the compliance functions, which then, as anybody, we all know, certain sectors are more prone to regulations and compliance-related activities. Certain are not. But that trend seems to be now kind of equalizing with this whole data and access to data and information, and who can put in certain information at that point. And now you want to validate the IDs, the identities, the access, and all those things. So it's a cycle that keeps going up and down. And while, Tom, you absolutely are right, compliance is a necessary function of every organization. But if you lose that balance, then you will tend to start designing by compliance instead of securing by actually looking at what the needs is. One more point I'll stress out here is IAM programs, projects are multi-year, multi-dimensional, large-scale transformation. When you might have actually started with a really good thought and idea in mind, it takes over a period of 2, 3, 4 years to start transformation. And guess what? A new administration comes in, and bang, new rules come in, right? And then you have to completely shift, maybe not completely, but you got to start shifting direction in that case. So yeah, we got to find that balance, absolutely, between design and compliance.
Yeah, and I think not just even administrations, but like sometimes the landscape of what's happening around us is changing, right? Like more incidents and things like that, then that drives maybe regulation or even just natural momentum, I think. One of the things that, because we kick this off of like, what's your mission, right, as an organization, and are you staying true to your mission, right? I think most organizations that come into it, like, my mission is securing the organization. And I think that's obviously that's what we're passionate about as security practitioners at the end of the day, right? That's where we focus, and we're always looking at where the nefarious points are and how our organization may be impacted and things like that. But I think if we think about maybe what are some red flags to identify, maybe I'm not continuing to be aligned to my mission, right? It'd be curious to hear from you two what those might be. But my initial thoughts are like, for example, are you as an organization or as a program applying the same approach across the enterprise without any consideration of business impact or even risk, right? Like, are you just peanut butter approaching the security control just because it needs to be there? Is your reporting solely focused on controls and compliance rather than maybe the effectiveness of compliance? I think a great one is I've walked into organizations where good 85% of the team is just spending their time chasing audit, questions and supporting audit investigations and things like that. Again, to Tom's point, not leaving room for the kind of continued progression that needs to happen in any security organization, right? And then strategic initiatives often take a back seat to the point we made earlier. And they change maybe to be able to preventing us from being able to take advantage of what's needed. And then we really focus on just getting ahead of compliance as opposed to getting ahead of what we're trying to do from securing the organization. So I don't know if you guys had any other thoughts about what red flags you see as far as organizations go, or even what should the mission of a cyber organization or program really be, right? Just thoughts on that.
Tom, you want to go?
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Mission statement, Zubaid, we think of that as just 2 words, but I'll tell you, everything is grounded in your mission statement. If you have a weak mission statement, there has been studies done that says a weaker mission statement correlates to weaker objectives, correlates to weaker controls, and correlates to absolutely no minimum influence that cybersecurity has on the broader mission of the company. So whenever I used to do a 100-day planning session for CISOs, new CISOs come on board, we would do a 100-day session for them. And I would always encourage them. I would say think about this. You've been given a new slate coming into a company, right? Yes, the company previously had a particular mission statement. You've been brought on to do something. And it could be anything. It could be, we need to, Tom, like you mentioned, maybe the need of the hour is we got this 100 MRAs. We just got to plow through them. That's fine. That is your mission statement, right? We need to be compliant. We need to make sure all our controls are according to certain standards or something like that. When you know that, and when you start defining a simple mission statement, it literally starts going down into the objectives of the day. Now, mission statement in my mind, is a living, breathing statement. As a company evolves, as it transforms, you will notice business missions, business objectives will start tweaking, start changing. And I think as they change, accordingly, the cybersecurity's mission statement also needs to be aligned, needs to be changed. Who is my customer base? Who are my internal stakeholders? What is my company trying to sell? How are they generating revenues? Where are they based? Are they in the United States? Are they global? All of these factors start playing into that one. Tom, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, you guys are giving some good, I think, concrete examples. I'll add a couple more, right? I think to your point around MRAs or matters requiring attention or significant deficiencies or audit findings, right? If you're coming into a program or you're listening to us today saying, hey, I have this problem right now, right? I'm being pressured to close XYZ gaps before I innovate, before I do anything else. What should I be doing, right? I think one of the things you want to be doing first is understand the scope of what it is your regulators, your auditors, your executive leadership is asking you to close, right? In terms of to become quote unquote compliant. And what I mean by that is when I traditionally come into an organization and they say, hey, Tom, we've got these 6 MRAs or we've got these 2 significant issues, whatever it is, we need you to close them. The first thing I do is sit down and make sure I read them, right, thoroughly and understand what they are. But I also go back to the person or individuals that created them. And a lot of times what I found is that, one, they didn't really understand the surface area, right, of what the problem really was. So what I mean by that is you have to be careful sometimes about trying to comply to something that you will never be successful at. Right. So, for instance, if a regulator comes in or an internal auditor who doesn't understand IAM suddenly comes to the CISO or to you and says, hey, I'm not going to give you a passing grade until you put every application onto the IAM platform. There's your red flag, right? Number one. I mean, examples like that are things that you need to look for. Terminology in requirements to close gaps that don't make logical sense, or as in nature of what you know about IAM, as a subject matter expert, or as a person leading the program at your company, you need to challenge it, right? And I think so. My point there is get it to a point that it's makes sense. It's something that you can succeed on to close whatever those gaps are. And also, if you do find, that there are some discrepancies with the scope of it, with the way it was worded, sit down with your auditor, sit down with your regulator, educate them, right? And what you'll find is that they're human like all of us, right? They make mistakes and they're like, you know what, hey Tom, I think you're right. I don't think I really understood that until you just explained it that way. So let's work together to kind of recast this, right? And so suddenly that bigger problem that you had maybe just got a little smaller, and that's a good thing, right? Because again, remember the balance, guys, right? You're trying to, if you've got everything on the compliance side and very little on the maturity, development, innovation side, and you could cut this down a little bit, well, this side's going to go up a little bit more, and that's a good thing, right?
Tom, that point you mentioned, let me give you 2 examples, because that is such a relevant point out there. And I'll give you 2 examples. Yes, regulators are human beings. Absolutely. Some of them are good friends of mine, and we talk often. And they, yes, of course, there's always variations, but broadly, they want to see good things happen to their stakeholders, which are the common man, the users out there. They want to make sure that their information is protected, companies are operating in the proper manner. And what often at times I do is I'll have my kind of informal education sessions with them, and they'll share this. I'm going to do this examination on this one particular technology or piece, but I privately, they'll say, I could use some more education. And so I do those kind of knowledge shares with them. One example, I'll tell you, one of my clients received an MRA, or rather a notice of action out there, about cyber resiliency and how IAM platforms were not still secure or not robust enough. The client brought me in to look at this notice, and while we were going through that, we realized, yes, the client did have the good practices in place, the good technologies and all, but often at times there's a little hesitancy to counter what the regulators say, right? So they're like, well, we got this. How do I do this? And it's literally a matter of going through that one. And when you start looking at it and say, oh, you got this, but maybe you don't have a small piece of that one, and educating the regulator, they themselves then say, oh, you know what? We did not know about that part. So this in turn becomes a lot of awareness and education part of it also, which then starts getting into your objectives and how you move forward with that. So
yeah, that's right.
Spot on those 2 points.
Yeah, I mean, again, you have to be realistic, right, with everything. I mean, the red flags in these programs, you look for, the words all or nothing, right, are in any terminology, right, in the policies, in the way that, issues have been written up, in the risk finding register, whatever it might be. When you start seeing words like all or nothing, or extremes like that, red flags, right? You're going to immediately not going to be successful, right? There's not an IAM program on the planet that can say, I implemented every single application to my IAM platform. No, nope. There's not a single one, not one.
Yeah. And I would argue, nor should there be, right?
Yeah, and right, exactly. You're never going to be all things to all people. You just need to, people need to be reasonable. I think when you get yourself into a situation where, and I've been there, where I took on a program and the new CISO inherited language from the prior CISO, which was exactly the example I gave a few minutes ago about onboarding all the applications to the IAM platform. And the new CISO and I, had to go back and sit with the auditors and the regulator and like all these people that signed off on this thing, thinking that that was the right thing to do for the company. And of course, the regulator just kept coming in and saying, "Well, you said you're gonna do everything. Look, it's right here, right?" And no, sorry, the person that was here wasn't in the same sense of mind when they signed that, and here's why, right? So anyway, I'm giving you some humor here, but it's in all seriousness, it's a big deal, right? Because if you can't get past that, then you're in big trouble because you're not going to be able to ever get it done, right?
And I think that's why it's important for programs and organizations to really work with their risk partners hand in hand, right? To be able to define what that success looks like, and again, go back to what's the spirit of the controls in the first place. Like what's really the objective? Is it just to get that checkbox done, or are we actually really trying to secure the organization? I mean, access certifications are a great example, right? I mean, everybody's trying to get those in, especially those organizations that are regulated. But at some point, they start losing value when you start giving a reviewer hundreds or thousands of lines of access that may or may not make sense for identities they may or may not know, right? And at that point, you're just begging for rubber stamping at best. And that's why I think we're seeing technologies certainly looking at how they're doing access certifications, maybe introduce outlier or AI and ML or analytics to be able to then maybe fine tune what it is that reviewers are looking at so they can be more informed when they make those decisions. Like we're seeing that because I think of the nature of we're just trying to trace compliance and get that certification out there. Oh, phew, we got it done. But now nobody knows what they're looking at. And not only that, I think they're spending a significant amount of time doing those certifications, right? And they don't look at it as a something, well, they don't look at it as an enjoyable activity for sure, right? I mean, almost every organization you talk to, when you talk to the business, they're like, you got to do these certifications. And, I think that goes to maybe the kind of the next segment, like if not compliance, then what, right? So what should we as an organization or as a controls organization or security organization or a program really be focused on, right? And I think at the end of the day, we really need to be looking at end users, right? And what their scenarios are like, what that looks like for them, like what their experience is. Yep. I mean, for in the IAM space, we have internal identities, and Tom, you mentioned customer identity access management. I'm a CIAM guy. I don't know, are you guys CIAM or CIAM? What's the vote?
I never heard CIAM. That's a new one.
Oh, you're CIAM? Okay. I think it's like a potato type thing.
Maybe that's a local slang thing. I always called it CIAM. So.
Maybe it's a Philly thing. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, so customer identity access management is very focused on what's the experience of your users. Well, why shouldn't internal identities be the same thing? Because at the end of the day, I mean, we're always being told, every identity is responsible for security. It's, every employee is responsible for security. That's great. And you can do as much training as you want. That's also important, right? I'm not diminishing it anyway, but those aren't end alls, right? Like at the end of the day, you need to somehow motivate them and bring them along the process. And if they feel that it's distracting them from their core mission, which is whatever the business's objective is, right? Or getting that product out or that, finishing a certain milestone and things like that on their end, if they feel like that's a deviation from their mission and it's a long one, they're not going to be interested in helping you out, right? And not going to really try to put their all into it. So that's part of the balance. I think that this topic is really about is like, if not compliance, then what? It's about enabling the business. It's about realigning your objective. I think Perry, and Tom, you guys said it good. At the end of the day, it's how you view yourself as an organization translates into what your priorities are, how you articulate what your value is to the organization, and how you prioritize, right, and spend the money of the business at the end of the day. And I think that's really an important kind of alignment that needs to happen. And we're seeing that, I think, in some organizations, and I think in other ones that are now realizing the importance of that are certainly trying to shift the way they look at the programs at the end of the day and kind of the objectives of those programs. I think a lot of times some organizations are very focused on, and to Tom, I think you kind of highlighted this a little bit. It's like, what are you trying to achieve? I want to get SailPoint in, or I want to get, an IGA tool in. That's great, right? And, all those tools are extremely important. They're critical. But what is how are you planning on using it? What's the adoption around that technology? And that's just as important, right, as getting the functionality of those tools in as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead, Tom. Yeah.
you touched on one of the two examples I'd like to try to weave into the conversation today for the audience, and that's certifications, right?
Yeah.
So again, what you don't want to do is a check the box exercise, right? And a lot of the certification vendors, and even some of, and be very careful about your system integrators that you choose, right? And the message they're telling you, because you don't want to introduce to an organization that hasn't done certification of access, hasn't done attestations, and suddenly go to line item certifications in 2021. You do not want to be doing that anymore, right? And anyone that tells you that that's what you should be doing, you need to challenge that, right? Because there are better, smarter ways to do that in today's world with the technologies that are out there and with the vendors that are supporting it, right? Line item certifications are a thing of the past, right? I mean, not too long ago at a very major bank that I worked at, right, we had millions of line item certifications coming out every quarter, millions, not thousands, but millions, right? And think about that, right? There is no way possible that most of that is even valuable to anyone, to the end line manager that's trying to do the certification, to the auditor that's looking at it, trying to make heads or tails whether or not you've done it right. So you want to move away from that, right? So this is a perfect example of when you're being pressured to do something from a compliance reason, which is, hey, you have no certification of access, you need to do certifications. Great. And if people are pushing you really hard to let's just get the applications integrated to Savient or into One Identity or into whatever, and let's do line item certifications so we can close this gap, we can close this audit. That's the easy way out, right? And what I mean by that is the vendors will say, yeah, we can do this for you. We can get you certifications right away. And you sit down with the business and they're like, okay, well, what does this mean, Tom? Well, this means that all of your personnel are going to be sitting in front of a screen trying to figure out whether or not this entitlement or this role is appropriate for Tom. And as best as you can with PBL, or what we know as plain business language, try to explain what that thing is that Tom has. The person, most of the time, over 60% of the time, stats show, doesn't understand what they're looking at, right? So they either need to call up the manager of the team or call the individual in and say, hey, what is this thing that you have, right? I mean, that's the best practice. Now, again, to me, what I would recommend the audience is doing, if you're being pressured in that direction, sit down and try to think about smart ways that you can introduce certification without having to do all fine grain. The new dynamic is to do coarse versus fine grain separation, do automation on birthright privileges using attributes, reduce your surface area of what you're provisioning to people by utilizing dynamic authorization or just-in-time provisioning. Totally embraces the concept of zero trust, which maybe we'll do on a future webinar for this audience. But my point is, don't be copacetic with the traditional IGA approach of line item certifications. You don't have to do that, right? There are better ways that you can advance that ball, close the gap, and make your business people and your personnel at your company a lot happier, and you'll have a much better, much secure program, because line item certifications are not really doing a whole lot to reduce risk, because people don't know what they are, they don't understand them, right? And they're rubber stamping them, right? And that's a bad practice.
And Tom, I think you nailed it, which is, and that's really the whole premise of this thing, is that you shift away from just chasing some type of, objective around access certifications and really understand what they're meant to be.
Right.
And now you've found compliance, right? Like it's the natural progression. I mean, reality is all these compliance rules are there to secure the organization. So if we go and try to secure the organization in an effective way, we're going to meet compliance in some way, right? And
Exactly.
there's ways to align that very easily. And I think that's a great point. One of the things that also, from certifications and some anecdote from some past clients is that part of the other challenge of certifications is how do you get that business language of those, that access, whether it's a role or entitlement or whatever the case may be. And the only person who really knows that is obviously sometimes the business, right? but then sometimes you need to get them to take ownership of that data, which that's a whole, maybe another topic, but like that's a whole political beast that happens, and that organizations especially cyber organizations really deal with, and pushing the onus out to the business, right? And again, that's a huge challenge. In an organization that I was helping, a previous client, was that they were seen as the bottleneck, right? The business had all these applications and platforms that they wanted to onboard into, whether it's MFA or certifications or self-service access requests and things like that, right, to their IGA platform, and they wanted to onboard them on, but it would just take a long time, or an owner's process of back and forth between the security organization and the business to get that done. So the security organization said, you know what, we're going to take a little bit of time, and we're going to create a self-service capability that allows the application, or the business team rather, to then port their system through the process, using CI/CD, right? Like being able to spin up and spin down platforms for test environments, have test data and things like that, test harnesses. And now you've enabled the business to self-service, one. Two, now they own and have governance of the application and the data themselves, right? Which is key. And that's really the dream of every cyber organization, that now they've focused on it, right? And they're invested in owning it. And now you've gotten out of the way, and you're not seen as a bottleneck, and now you've built trust within the organization, right? So a lot of things just started aligning naturally, because they just shifted the way they were focused. Instead of trying to mandate a certain capability across all applications, saying you have to come to us and we'll do it. Now we allow you to do it, and now you're vested in performing it, and now it's a partnership, right?
Yep.
Zubed, I'll add one example to what you mentioned. If not compliance, then what, right? I don't think it's an either or situation. I think, Tom, you're right. Compliance is an absolutely necessary part of any organization, right? How do you balance that part? And I'll give you an example. About a few years back, I was asked to come and kind of talk to the board of directors for a payment processing company. They would transfer user-based payments to global around their networks and everything. And they wanted to enter into Afghanistan. Of all the countries, I mean, great country and everything. I love it. But they wanted to enter there, and they wanted to transfer right down to the last mile, sending money over. Controls, right? We're talking about controls. In the Western world and all, they had fantastic controls. They had all the MFAs. They had all the necessary checks and balances. The question came, and this was directly tied to their business strategy of, expanding into other countries. Primarily, the country Afghanistan was chosen because of a certain demographics of population that were out there that could probably benefit from this thing. The question came at that time was, okay, let's do that one. But you're going to fail every compliance part out there. Your compliance to your company policies that says you need to have two-factor, multi-factor authentication before you can actually structure or clear or settle the payment over there, and all of those things. So in this case, what we, I'll just kind of boil this down to think. With compliance, with legal, with internal audit, technology, all in the room, it was a matter of an education thing. We had an agreement that for some time, a period, we would design the system such that people, think about it, people don't even have cell phones over there. So how are you going to send them, that text or the code or verification code or emails out there? So you can start by doing that in a pilot manner, like, targeted to a certain population. You can get the necessary risk of exceptions, risk authorizations from the company, and you can start moving in that direction. So I think compliance is a necessary thing, but that balance has to be set whenever you are embarking on a new thing, whether you are looking at an existing platform, you're trying to upgrade it, you're looking at it from a hygiene point of view. All of those things start playing into conversations.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it's important for us to kind of reiterate that, Perry, which is, we're not in any way saying compliance is not important. What we're saying is that if it's consuming you, right, and if it's your end all be all for existing, and it's become that way, which we've seen in organizations, you're losing out, right? And to Tom's point at the very beginning, is like there's an opportunity cost to that, right? And I think that needs to be certainly weighed in. But yeah, you're right. I mean, we need that's I think that struggle between business enablement and security, and those two kind of levels of friction are going to perpetually be part of our business and our scope, right? That's always it. But focusing and working with that balance, which is unique for your organization, I think is the key part, right? And I think that's, how do you see yourself as a partner within the business as opposed to some type of like, enforcement agent, right? Within the organization is really important. What I've seen successful IAM programs achieve great, missions and things like that is when they start seeing themselves as almost like a consumable service, right? That requires its own marketing, has beneficial outcomes to the business, and builds trust both internally and sometimes even externally, right? Depending on what it is. Like if you start seeing yourself as that way, now you start articulating the value back to the business. And I think obviously, CISOs and CXOs and boards certainly recognize the importance of cyber, and they're willing to throw money at it, but they're still trying to understand what's the value that I'm getting out of it, right? They just don't want to hear that like, well, I'm going to put in privileged access management. Well, that's great, right? But what does that get me? How does that prevent future, incidents and things like that? But also, how does that help the business get to speed, right? We don't want to be in the way of business at the end of the day. When and kind of the last segment of this is let's shift to like tactical, and we've peppered a little bit of into the conversation. But if we're thinking about tactically, how do I as a program or as a cyber organization really shift away from compliance driven, right, and consumed compliance focus to kind of broader business enablement? I think part of it is are we measuring the effectiveness of controls is a key one, right? Because now we're looking at whether or not we're really securing the organization. We've gotten the spirit of it behind it, right? And then what's the user experience? How intuitive is it? What's the ease of use of adoption of security services by end users? How seamless can security be incorporated into business operations, right? Especially when you think about DevOps and things like that, right? The fact that security can now inherently be built in. Obviously, a lot of cloud has inherent security capabilities that are not always configured right or leveraged right, which we've seen in the past week or two. But those are things that we can help the business just quickly upfront solve, and now the business can operate and get to speed. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, Todd, and he had a great analogy. He's like, why do cars have brakes, right? And maybe you all have heard this one. The most common answer is like to stop and things like that. But it's really so it allows us to go fast, right? And I think at the end of the day, the business is the car, and security, right, is the brakes that we're there in case something's needed, right? We need to slow down. We'll slow down the business if necessary, but we don't want to always have the brakes on, right? We want to be able to allow them to operate at speed, but have the security to do so and the comfort to do so, right? I think risk-based approach to security initiatives is certainly valuable, and we're seeing a lot of that amongst clients, right? To be able to articulate where they're solving actual risks within the organization, and I think zero trust certainly plays a little bit into that, right? But so you need to maybe find the right granularity of where you capture that risk, and that's part of that zero trust topic that Tom mentioned. But at the end of the day, it's outcome-based approach to security initiatives. I think is really the way to articulate how you're impacting, whether it's the bottom or the top line of the business, right? And I think those are some key things. I don't know, Tom or Perry, do you have any thoughts? And I certainly have some examples I was going to talk through, but before that, any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I just want to give one more layman's example, if I may, right, to try
Absolutely.
to help the audience understand this a little bit better, right? And this is a real use case. Won't mention the firm, but another big, corporate bank that I worked at previously. When I came in, the adoption of single sign-on or SSO was probably less than 30%. And that's 30% of the applications that they had in inventory, which is a horrible statistic, right? For those of you in the audience, you should be shooting between 60 to 70% or greater. And that's the maturity cycle. If you can get better than that, God bless you, right? But if you're lower than that, you're really away from the curve. Your maturity is much more immature as compared to your peers. So one of the issues there was around termination of access, right? When somebody left the firm, removing their access, right? And there was a large amount of manual processing in place to support that. And with less than 30% of the application stack being on single sign-on, obviously the challenge was pretty huge, right? Because the immediate thing was, hey, Tom, we just need to fix this, right? Tell me how many people you need. We'll hire another 100 people. We'll stick them in, some building and just have them, key away at removing access, because we have all these applications that have all their own, entitlements models. They're not tied into single sign-on. They're not tied into the primary IDP. And that's a problem, right? So what we did, we sat down and said, listen, Mr. Auditor, right? If I do this in the most aggressive way that I can to close this issue, here's when I can get it done, but you're only going to get about this much risk reduction, because I'm going to have to still do this manually, right? There's still going to be a human aspect, and I'm not really advancing the curve at all, and I'm spending a boatload of money to do it, right? What we did was we shifted that conversation to one of, hey, what if we were able to, first of all, tie automation to the termination event, right? In such a way that when a termination event occurs, access is removed immediately. And I'm like, oh, that would be great. I'm like, okay, great. So that's step one. I said, step two is you only have 30% of your population on single sign-on. What that means is that termination event can automate more removals if we get more applications onto single sign-on. So let's start an adoption across the company to get more applications federated, to get software as a service applications federated, to get more of the internal apps, onto the single sign-on solution. Because when people leave, I'll be able to automate more removals. Hence, I'm reducing my risk quicker. I'm reducing my cost because I'm not doing it manually, right? And that's a good example of what I took from a conversation that was completely compliance focused, right, to saying, how do we balance that a little bit so that we can innovate and make the program better? And to your point earlier, Zubayd, the outcome of that mission was not only to close that gap, but we in parallel moved the program and the maturity of the IAM organization so much further, right? And that's a huge win, guys, right?
Yeah.
That's how you really want to address these things. Try to find ways that you can make your regulators, make your auditors, make your executive leadership happy, but don't be afraid to challenge it, right? And look for ways to innovate so that at the end of it, you're actually coming out to a better outcome.
Yeah, that's a great example. And quickly, I'd just like to say, hey, if there's questions out there, please, feel free to send them through the chat, through the platform, and we'll certainly take a look at them. One of the things, Tom, that you reminded me of is there was organizations I was working with that had an audit reason to automate provisioning to certain applications, right? And it was a high volume applications. It made sense, right? It was a ROI for it as well as a audit driver for it. But they weren't able to articulate the value. They weren't able to get the funding essentially to accomplish that across some of these major applications, right? They then shifted their approach and said, you know what? It is a retail organization, so there's a lot of seasonal transaction, right, or seasonal kind of changes of identities, right, that would come like in the summer and go and things like that. And there's a lot of changes that manual provisioning just couldn't keep up, right? They were then able to articulate, well, like, hey, business, right? Right now it takes you a week and a half maybe to get, your managers in all these shops access that they need, right, from complete provisioning. We can get that down to day zero, right? They were able to just change the conversation a bit. Same mission, same objective, just change the outcome, right? And to your point, it was the outcome that then gave them the funding that they needed and that they were requesting all along, right? Another organization that I'd worked with in the past was looking for funding to be able to, expand their program, implement PAM, implement IGA, modernize their platforms, the kind of the whole gamut of an IAM program. But again, the funding wasn't there. It was multiple lines of business. And they were trying to push out a capability that needed to then be adopted by the business, right? That was kind of the approach. And they completely shifted, right? To what I said earlier, they said, now we're going to be a service, right? We're going to be a consumable service. And now the business is coming to them. They've got buy-in, they've got funding, they're achieving compliance because now there's adoption happening throughout the business, right? Again, I think these are all examples, like between the three of us, what we've been saying is that like just shifting the conversation a little bit, right? Again, to Perry's point, we're not saying we're getting rid of compliance. We're just shifting the way we frame it, right? And that gets us to our end objectives and sometimes even further. And I think that these are really powerful anecdotes, I think, because it allows organizations to kind of really see that this is achievable, right? We're not talking, I guess theoretically, like we've seen this happen in the clients and the organizations that we've been a part of. Perry, were you going to say something else?
Yeah, and that part, Zubayd, when I said that compliance is an absolutely partner, there's an example that I want to share. Is it's a firm that was going to the cloud. They're moving to the cloud again. As any other security initiatives, we could always use more money. We could always use more resources, right, to do the right thing out there. Certain amount of funding, you're going to the cloud, you're moving your application sets to the cloud, data is going to the cloud. IAM platforms are being bolted on and used over there. These are cloud service providers and all. And the CISO was struggling with getting funding over there. And one of the things when we were brought in to kind of help him with the strategy was, how do you make the case? How do you articulate the value of it, right? This is something that, and in my career, where I sit with CISOs and I kind of train some of them and I walk them through the 100-day plan, one of the things that I often try to impress upon them is talk the language of the business, right? Because if you do that, think about it from the other side, right? The business, they struggle, they can't talk the language of the technology or the absolutely technical terms out there. So it's the other way around. So if we can articulate that, and the best way to articulate that one is if you can find out the metrics, the risk-based metrics. Hey, because of this XYZ metric out there, the data that we've collected, we probably are not going to be in compliance with GDPR or with the California law or with any one of these laws. And that in turn places a risk, and this is the impact, loss databases, loss frequency. It kind of takes you around that gamut. Business gets it, right? Because it now starts talking to them in terms of dollars and cents and all of those things. So when you change that conversation, the business really wants to do the right thing, but if we can't articulate, and we should take that upon ourselves as cybersecurity professional, to be able to articulate that in language that they understand out there. Because if you can do that, Zubayd, I've seen this happen, right? They are more willing to fund the programs. And
that's right. Yeah, that's a great point, Perry. Just to add on to say that the partnership in these programs is so important, right? As you're touching on, between the business, the CISO, your CIO, your executive board, right? Hopefully your program is getting that level of attention. And if it is, congratulations, because that's the level it needs to be at. And it's important that you partner with all those people, right? And you understand what's driving them in the conversation, right? If you go talk to the business, they're not going to care about certification of access, right? No, they're going to just say, hey, Tom, I get it, I have to do it, but talk to me about, how can I reduce the friction on my customer IAM program? Because I'm getting all sorts of complaints that, people hate it. They hate our login experience. They hate our mobile app. Let's talk about that, right? And you go talk to the CIO, he may have a different conversation around, and Zubayd touched on this earlier, I think, sort of the DevOps pipeline, or, hey, Tom, I'm worried about the whole multi-cloud experience, right? The business is pushing us from a CIO organization to be in Google, Amazon, all of them, right? And I'm worried that, I'm not able to control that, how can you help me, right? So you're going to get different perspectives, and it's important to, to listen.
I'll add one more thing to that, Tom, is, metrics, right? It's a fascinating topic out there. IAM metrics. The way one of the clients asked us to come and look at the entire metrics program, and I'll tell you this, I'm sitting with senior examiners at the OCC, and I'm talking to them, and they're like, listen, we don't want you to give me 60 metrics, right? We just don't care. We just want to know that you looked at maybe 5 or 6 or 10 metrics that are actual adding value over there. So the client brought us in to look at the entire 60, 70 operational metrics. I'm like, who even looks at these metrics, right? I mean, you put this out, and sometimes the report goes out, you look at it, you glance it, you haven't even understood what the hell you're trying to protect, and all of those things. In this one particular example, actually, the bank was going with mobile application, right? And so the type of metrics to prove the value to the business was multi-factor authentication. How many of the customers of the bank are actually using that? So that then reduces the calls made into the call centers, the usage of the mobile app to reset passwords, to set in security questions. When we were able to kind of run that and pull out the metrics, 70% of your users are using that, 30% are not using it. Okay, all right, why are 30% not using it, right? So the business side came and said, we got to figure this out. Those 30% were people in a particular demographics. After they did that, they found out that they were not very comfortable using mobile phones for sending out those things out. And they would rather visit a branch and ask somebody to help them reset that part. They immediately put in a program in place to address that particular segment of population. There was a happier population out there, greater user experience. The business came back and said, you guys rock. I mean, if you hadn't told us that, we would have pushed this down. We would have made that 30% uncomfortable, unhappy. Now because of this metrics, we are able to find out that particular population needs a little bit hand-holding out there, and we put that program in place. The feedback we're getting is fantastic, right? So these are actionable metrics. We need to move in that way. The other thing I will say straight off the bat, not one metric that works for technology may not work for the regulators, may not work for the business side, may not work for compliance. When you look at the metrics, it's a fascinating field. You have to break it down per audience that you're trying to engage with out there. We did a prototype of that, worked great. Regulators, it's the same base, but the visualization, data reports was crafted for that particular audience. That's something that I've seen that is working.
And one of the questions that we got was, which metrics can help demonstrate value of the IAM program? And I think that's a great question. And Perry, I know you touched a little bit upon it. Just as far as like metrics go, it's not an easy answer, right, for everybody. But I think there are certain metrics that are easy ways to really measure the effectiveness of the controls that you're trying to put in place, rather than the fact that people are using the controls, right, or being prevented by the controls. I think that's really important. The great one is access certifications, right? I mean, it's an easy one. You can see who's done them. You can see how many they've accomplished, how many they've approved, and things like that. That's certainly maybe somewhat valuable, right, to see who's using it and who's doing what, and maybe you can get some information on that. But the real value of certifications is, what's the end result? Do I have more least privilege than I should, right, than I did before? Like, have I removed access that is over provisioned? And I think there's metrics that you can calculate on how are people, where's the outlier access, for example, or are people over provisioned, or identities over provisioned, not just people, right? Obviously there's systems and things like that could also be over provisioned. So, measure that in correlation to what's happening around the certification. And now you have a better connection point to the effectiveness of those controls, right? So I think the best way to answer that is, like, it's not just one metric that's going to get that. It's coupling maybe different metrics to show that there's been some outcome at the end of the day. Right. I don't know, Tom, if you had thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, just throw out a couple quick ones to give real concrete examples, right? Again, the caveat I'll say is the metrics will change based on where you are in your program, right? Yes. And so what you do in year 1 is going to be different than what you do in year 3 or year 5, right? But a couple of basic ones, if you're just starting out, maybe your termination of access, right, today is all manual. And so it takes you, I don't know, maybe 3 days, 5 days, 2 weeks to get rid of all the access when people leave. You can start tracking that, right, with your new IAM program, hopefully introduced automation, tied automation to an identity event, and suddenly your metrics are really showing great value, right? I think that's one of them. I touched on SSO earlier, right? If your program is pushing to get applications onto single sign-on, what's the percentage of your population month to month in terms of, what apps are going on? And that's obviously reducing your risk profile. Zubayd, you touched on certifications. There's definitely a couple of basic ones, but I think, Perry, to your point, you absolutely don't want 20 or 30 of them because you'll first of all, you'll never be able to support it.
Yeah.
I think just starting, I would recommend, frankly, 5 or less, right?
Yeah.
5 or less key ones. And again, they're going to change because your team is going to need to prepare that. And as much as you can do it automated is great, but you're always going to have a manual component whenever you're producing metrics. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and some of it is to articulate value, and then it can be operationalized and just be like to monitor, right? So I think there's different ways those metrics are used. But so we are at the end of the hour. I want to obviously thank IDSA for hosting us. I want to thank Tom and Perry for really an engaging conversation. I learned a lot, so I hope the audience, found some benefit from it as well. I think this is something that we're all passionate about, and I'm sure there's others on the webinar that were also just as passionate. So we'd love to hear from you if you had thoughts as well. But again, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Zubayd.